Father James Sullivan had given last rites to 89 dying inmates over 20 years. He'd held their hands as they took final breaths. He'd whispered prayers over men who'd committed unspeakable crimes. But when the young man bleeding out in the prison infirmary looked up at him with familiar brown eyes and whispered, "You're my father. I know the truth," everything Father Sullivan believed about God, redemption, and forgiveness shattered in an instant. This is the story of a priest, a dying son, and a secret that would expose the darkest corners of both the prison system and the human soul. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about faith and family. Father James Sullivan was 53 years old when he received the call at 2:47 in the morning. Cell block D, medical emergency. Chaplain requested immediately. He'd gotten these calls hundreds of times over his 20-year tenure as chaplain at Riverside State Penitentiary. Death didn't follow a schedule in prison. Men died from violence, from illness, from despair. And when they did, someone needed to be there to offer whatever comfort faith could provide in those final moments. James threw on his black shirt and white collar, grabbed his worn leather Bible, and drove through the empty streets toward the prison. The route was so familiar he could have driven it in his sleep. Past the closed storefronts, past the all-night diner where truckers stopped for coffee, past the billboard advertising injury lawyers. 20 years of this drive had made it automatic, meditative almost. He showed his credentials at the gate, passed through 3 security checkpoints, and made his way to the infirmary. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness outside, making everything look sterile and cold. A guard he didn't recognize led him to the bed in the far corner, separated from the others by a privacy curtain. "The patient is critical," the guard said quietly. "Multiple stab wounds, lost a lot of blood. He probably won't make it through the night. Requested a priest specifically. Asked for you by name." James nodded, preparing himself mentally and spiritually for what came next. This part never got easier, no matter how many times he'd done it. Each dying person was unique. Each death mattered. He pushed aside the curtain and stopped so abruptly that the guard behind him nearly walked into him. The young man on the bed was maybe 25 years old, with dark hair matted with sweat and blood, olive skin gone pale from blood loss, and brown eyes that looked up at James with an expression that made the priest's heart stop. Those eyes. James knew those eyes. He saw them every morning in the mirror. The same deep brown, almost black. The same shape. The same way they crinkled slightly at the corners. "Father Sullivan," the young man whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Thank you for coming. I'm David. David Martinez." James moved closer on autopilot, his mind reeling even as his body performed familiar motions. He pulled up a chair beside the bed, opened his Bible with hands that trembled slightly. "Of course," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm here, David. How can I help you?" David coughed, a wet sound that suggested internal bleeding. "The doctors say I have maybe 4 hours, maybe less. I was stabbed in the yard this afternoon. Gang-related. Wrong place, wrong time. Story of my life, really." James wanted to ask questions, wanted to understand why this young man's face was so familiar, why those eyes haunted him. But he'd learned over 20 years that dying men needed to talk, needed to unburden themselves. His job was to listen. "I've been here for 3 years, David continued. "Drug charges, possession with intent to distribute, stupid choices when I was younger. But I've been trying to turn my life around. Been coming to your Bible study groups, been reading scripture, trying to make peace with God before I get out." James felt a flicker of recognition. He did remember David now, a quiet young man who sat in the back during chapel services, who asked thoughtful questions about forgiveness and redemption. But there were so many inmates. James couldn't know all of them personally. "I'm glad you found faith," James said gently. "God's grace is available to everyone, David. Even in the darkest places, especially in the darkest places." David smiled slightly, then winced in pain. "That's what I needed to hear. But Father, there's something else. Something I need to tell you before I die. Something about you, about us." James felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" David reached under his pillow with a shaking hand and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His movements were slow, each one clearly causing pain. "I did a DNA test 6 months ago," he said quietly. "One of those mail-order kits. I sent in my sample, and I also sent in something of yours. A coffee cup you left in the chapel. I needed to know if what my mother told me before she died was true." James felt the world tilt. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the antiseptic smell of the infirmary too strong. What did your mother tell you? David unfolded the paper, his eyes filling with tears. She told me that my father was a man named James Sullivan, a seminary student she dated for 2 years in the early 90s. She told me that when she got pregnant, you were about to take your vows. She didn't want to ruin your calling, so she left, moved to another state, raised me alone, never contacted you, never told you I existed. James felt like he couldn't breathe. Maria Santos. He hadn't thought about her in years, had buried those memories under decades of service and prayer and deliberate forgetting. But suddenly she was vivid in his mind. Beautiful Maria with her dark hair and bright laugh. Maria who'd understood his calling, even when it meant losing her. Maria who'd disappeared without explanation right before his ordination, leaving only a brief note saying she needed to find her own path. James had grieved her loss, had prayed for her happiness, had eventually accepted it as God's will that they weren't meant to be together. But she'd been pregnant, she'd been carrying his child, and she'd never told him. David, James whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I swear before God, I didn't know. I would have. He stopped, unsure what he would have done. Would he have left the seminary? Would he have chosen family over faith? He'd spent his entire adult life as a priest. It was who he was. But looking at this dying young man, his son, James felt the weight of every choice he'd never had the chance to make. I know you didn't know, David said softly. Mom made sure of that. She thought she was protecting you. Protecting your calling. She worked 2 jobs to raise me. Did her best. She was a good mom. But she got sick 5 years ago. Cancer. Before she died, she told me about you. Told me your name. Told me you'd become a priest at a prison. She made me promise not to contact you. Said it would only cause pain for both of us. But when I got arrested and ended up here, at this prison, I couldn't help myself. I started coming to your services, started watching you, trying to see if I could see myself in you. James wiped his eyes, tears streaming down his face now. He'd counseled hundreds of inmates about forgiveness and grace. He'd talked about God's plan and divine purpose. But sitting here with his dying son, a son he'd never known existed, all those words felt hollow. I see it now, he said. Your eyes, your hands, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. How did I not see it before? Because you weren't looking for it, David replied. Why would you be? But Father, I need you to know something. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter about growing up without a father. Mom did enough for both parents. And finding out you were here, getting to know you even from a distance, that's been a gift. I've watched you with other inmates. Watched you offer comfort to men everyone else has given up on. You're a good priest. A good man. You have been a father to hundreds of people who needed one. That matters. James shook his head, guilt overwhelming him. But I should have been your father. You should have had that. You deserved that. David coughed again, and when he pulled his hand away from his mouth, there was blood on his palm. The monitors beside his bed started beeping more urgently. Father, I don't have much time. I need to tell you the real reason I wanted you here. It's not just to reveal this secret. It's because there's something wrong happening in this prison, and you're the only one I trust to expose it. James leaned forward, torn between his grief and the urgency in David's voice. What do you mean? David's breathing was more labored now, each word an effort. I wasn't stabbed because of gangs. I was stabbed because I witnessed something I shouldn't have. 3 weeks ago I saw a guard, Officer Frank Morrison, beating an inmate to death in the storage room. The official report said the inmate died of a heart attack, but I watched Morrison kick him until he stopped moving. James felt ice in his veins. Frank Morrison was one of the senior guards, well liked by administration, considered a model officer. Are you certain? David nodded weakly. I'm certain, and Morrison knew I saw. He came to me that night, told me that if I ever said anything I'd end up dead too. Said he had connections with every gang in this place. Said he could make it look like anything. I was terrified. Didn't know what to do. And then today in the yard, 3 inmates came at me. They didn't rob me, didn't say anything, just stabbed me and walked away. Morrison was on duty. He saw it happen and did nothing. James felt rage building alongside his grief. This can't stand. I'll report this immediately. I'll go to the warden, to the police. David grabbed his hand with surprising strength. You can't just report it. Morrison has been covering his tracks for years. Other guards protect him. He's got inmates on his payroll. If you report it without evidence, it'll be your word against his, and you'll paint a target on your own back. James didn't care about that, but he could see David had more to say. What do you need me to do? Under my mattress, David said. There's a phone. Contraband. I know, but I've been recording Morrison. Recording his threats. Recording conversations with other inmates about what he's done. It's all there. Take it. Get it to someone outside the prison system. A reporter maybe. Someone who can investigate without Morrison knowing it's coming. Make sure my death means something. Make sure this doesn't keep happening. James reached under the mattress and found the phone. Small and cheap but potentially containing evidence of murder and corruption. He slipped it into his pocket, his mind already racing through who he could contact. How he could expose this without putting others at risk. I'll do it, he promised. I'll make sure Morrison faces justice. I swear it. David smiled, looking more peaceful now. Thank you. And Father, there's one more thing. I need your forgiveness. James blinked in confusion. You need my forgiveness. For what? For not telling you sooner. For watching you all these years and staying silent. For putting you in this position now. Making you deal with this truth while I'm dying. I know this isn't fair to you. The grief hit James like a physical blow. David, you have nothing to apologize for. If anyone needs forgiveness, it's me. I should have known. Should have stayed in touch with your mother. Should have been there for both of you. David shook his head slightly. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. But I did, and I chose silence. I chose to protect myself from possible rejection rather than give you the chance to know me. That was selfish. James took both of David's hands in his own. Listen to me carefully. There is nothing to forgive. You gave me a gift tonight. You let me know that I have a son. That somewhere in this world my blood continues. That Maria's beautiful spirit lives on in you. That's more than I ever expected to have. The monitor alarms grew more insistent. A nurse appeared at the curtain, checking the machines with a grim expression. Father, I need to check his vitals. We might need to call the doctor. James didn't move. Let me have a few more minutes, please. The nurse looked at David's face, saw the peace there despite the pain and nodded. A few minutes, then I have to intervene. After she left, David spoke again, his voice barely a whisper now. Will you pray with me? Not the last rites yet, just a prayer. A father's prayer for his son. James had prayed thousands of prayers in his life. He'd prayed over the sick, the dying, the condemned. He'd prayed for guidance and strength and wisdom, but he'd never prayed as a father for his own child. The words came from somewhere deep inside him, not from any liturgy or remembered scripture, but from his heart. God, he began, his voice shaking. I stand before you tonight as a father who never got to hold his son as a baby. Who never got to teach him to ride a bike, or help with homework, or watch him grow into the remarkable man lying here. I'm grateful beyond words for these moments. For the chance to know David even briefly. For the honor of being his father, even if I never earned that title through action. He paused, tears flowing freely now. I ask you to welcome David home with open arms. He is good and brave and kind. He faced his death with grace, and used his final hours to fight for justice. He forgave when he could have been angry. He reached out when he could have stayed hidden. He is better than I ever was, better than I ever could be. Watch over him now as I couldn't watch over him in life. And if there's any mercy in this universe, let him feel loved. Let him know that in these final moments, his father is here, and his father loves him more than words can express. David squeezed James's hand weakly. That's all I ever wanted to hear. Thank you. They sat in silence for a moment. Father and son connected by blood and tragedy and faith. Finally, David spoke one last time. Father, I'm ready now. Will you give me the last rites? James opened his Bible with trembling hands and began the ancient ritual. Through this holy anointing, may the Lord in his love and mercy help you with the grace of the Holy Spirit. As he spoke the familiar words he'd spoken 89 times before to dying inmates, they felt different. Sacred in a way they'd never been before. He was sending his son to God, offering him to whatever came next with prayers and blessings. and a father's desperate hope that there was something beyond this pain, this loss, this tragedy. May the Lord who frees you from sin, save you and raise you up. David's eyes closed peacefully. His breathing became shallower. James held his hand, feeling the pulse grow weaker, feeling life slipping away from the son he'd just discovered. In the final moments, David opened his eyes one last time. "Dad," he whispered. The word hit James like lightning. He'd never been called that before, never expected to hear it, and hearing it now from his dying son broke something inside him that he hadn't even known was whole. "I love you," James said. "I love you, David. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry for everything you went through alone, but I'm here now. I'm here and I love you." David smiled, a genuine smile of peace and forgiveness, and then he was gone. The monitors flatlined, the alarms shrieked, medical staff rushed in, but James sat holding his son's still warm hand, feeling like his entire understanding of life and faith and purpose had been rewritten in the space of an hour. The nurse gently touched his shoulder. "Father, I'm sorry. We need to call it." James nodded numbly, releasing David's hand and stepping back to let them work. He watched them go through the motions of confirming what he already knew. David Martinez, inmate number 84729, time of death 3:58 a.m. Just a number to them, just another death in a prison full of death. But to James, he was so much more. He was Maria's son. He was proof that love could create life even when circumstances tried to prevent it. He was a young man who'd faced death with courage and used his final breaths to fight for justice. He was the son James never knew he had, and would now grieve for the rest of his life. James left the infirmary in a daze, the contraband phone heavy in his pocket, David's words echoing in his mind. "Make sure my death means something." He walked through the empty prison corridors, past sleeping inmates and bored night shift guards, out into the pre-dawn darkness. He sat in his car in the parking lot, and finally allowed himself to break down completely. Sobs racked his body as he grieved for David, for Maria, for all the years he'd lost, for all the moments he'd never have. He cried until he had no tears left, until the sun began to rise over the prison walls, casting long shadows across the pavement. Then he pulled himself together, started his car, and began to figure out how to honor his son's dying wish. Over the next week, James moved carefully. He couldn't trust anyone in the prison administration without knowing who might be connected to Morrison's corruption. Instead, he reached out to contacts outside the system, a reporter he knew from interfaith meetings, who'd covered criminal justice issues, a lawyer who did pro bono work for prisoners' rights, a retired FBI agent who attended his church. He gave them the phone, and what they found was damning. Hours of recordings, Morrison admitting to multiple instances of excessive force, conversations with other guards about covering up incidents, text messages arranging for inmates to attack other inmates in exchange for contraband or reduced sentences. David hadn't just recorded his own case, he'd documented a pattern of corruption and violence that went back years. The story broke like a bomb. Local news picked it up first, then national media. Prison corruption exposed by dying inmates' secret recordings. Morrison was arrested along with 4 other guards. The warden was forced to resign. The Department of Corrections launched a full investigation. And through it all, James said nothing about his personal connection to David Martinez. He let others tell the story of a brave young man who'd used his final hours to fight for justice. He attended the public memorial service held for David, sitting in the back, watching as inmates and advocates spoke about his courage. He watched as Maria's sister, an aunt David had mentioned but James had never met, accepted condolences from strangers. After the service, James approached her. "Excuse me, I'm Father Sullivan. I was with David when he passed. I wanted to offer my condolences." Maria's sister Rosa looked at him with sharp eyes that reminded him so much of Maria it hurt. "I know who you are, Father. David told me about you before he died, told me everything." James felt his world tilt again. "He told you?" Rosa nodded. "He called me from that contraband phone, the day before he was stabbed. Said he'd finally talked to you. Said he was going to reveal the truth that night. He wanted me to know in case something happened to him." She paused, studying his face. "You really didn't know about him until that night?" James shook his head. "I swear I didn't. If Maria had told me, I would have." He stopped, unsure again what he would have done. Rosa's expression softened slightly. Maria didn't tell you because she loved you. She knew being a priest was your calling. She didn't want you to have to choose between God and family. She thought she was doing the right thing. Was she? James asked. The question that had been haunting him. Was it right to keep this from me? Rosa was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. I fought with her about it. Told her you deserved to know. But Maria was stubborn. She believed some sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. She raised David to respect your calling, even if it meant respecting your absence. She paused, pulling an envelope from her purse. David wanted you to have this. He gave it to me before he went back to the prison, after our last visit. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it. James took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in David's handwriting and a photograph. The photo showed Maria holding a baby, both of them smiling at the camera. On the back, in Maria's handwriting, David, 6 months old. Your father never got to meet you, but he would have loved you so much. The letter was shorter than James expected, but more powerful than any sermon he'd ever read. Dear Father Sullivan, David had written, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you know the truth. I want you to know that I don't regret anything. Not growing up without you. Not ending up in prison. Not even dying young, if that's what happened. Everything led me to those final moments with you. Everything led me to hear you call yourself my father. Everything led me to that prayer you said over me. That was enough. That was more than enough. I spent my whole life wondering about you. And in the end, I got to know you were a good man doing good work. I got to see that Maria chose well when she fell in love with you. I got to understand why she protected your calling, even at the cost of her own happiness. Don't waste time on guilt or regret. You didn't know. You couldn't have changed anything. Instead, take this pain and transform it into purpose. Keep being the father figure to inmates who need you. Keep offering grace and forgiveness and hope to people everyone else has abandoned. And maybe, sometimes, when you're praying, remember that you have a son who loved you, even though he barely knew you. A son who was proud to be yours. A son who forgives you for not being there, because he understands that sometimes life makes impossible choices for us. Be at peace, Father. I am. Love, David. James read the letter 3 times, standing there in the parking lot, while Rosa waited patiently. When he finally looked up, she was watching him with Maria's compassionate eyes. He was a good kid, she said softly. Maria did a hell of a job raising him alone. I know, James replied. And I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that, honoring him. Rosa nodded. That's all David wanted. That's all Maria would have wanted too. She handed him a card with her phone number. If you ever want to know more about David's life, about who he was, I have photos and stories. Your family, Father Sullivan. You're David's father and Maria's. She paused, searching for the right word. You mattered to her. You mattered to us. Over the following months, James grappled with grief and guilt, and a strange kind of gratitude. He'd lost a son he'd never known he had. But he'd also gained knowledge of that son's existence. Brief though it was, he'd been given the gift of those final hours, of that prayer, of hearing himself called Dad by someone who had every right to be angry, but chose forgiveness instead. He continued his work as prison chaplain, but something had shifted. He understood now in a visceral way what it meant for families to be separated by incarceration. He understood the ripple effects of every choice, every moment, every connection broken or maintained. He started a program at the prison specifically for inmates who were fathers, helping them maintain relationships with their children, through letters and calls, and the few precious hours of visitation allowed. He worked with organizations that provided support for children of incarcerated parents, knowing firsthand how those children grew up with questions and absences that shaped their entire lives. And he talked about David, not publicly at first, but in small ways, mentioning to an inmate that he understood the pain of missing a child's life, sharing with a young father facing a long sentence, that it was never too late to try to connect, never too late to matter. Eventually, a year after David's death, James wrote an essay for a prison reform publication. He titled it The Son I Never Knew, and in it, he told the whole story. His relationship with Maria, her pregnancy, David's death, the corruption he'd exposed, the letter, the forgiveness, The essay went viral. It was reprinted in newspapers and discussed on talk shows. It sparked conversations about priestly celibacy and the unintended consequences of well-meaning secrets and the power of deathbed revelations. Some criticized James for his past relationship with Maria, saying it showed weakness incompatible with his vows. Others praised his honesty and his decision to use his pain to advocate for prison reform and family connection. The church hierarchy was divided. Some called for his removal from ministry. Others defended him, pointing to his 20 years of service and the good that had come from David's story being told. James didn't care much about the controversy. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to live up to an ideal of perfection, of unwavering faith, of complete dedication to God above all else. But David's death had taught him that God's plan was more complex and more beautiful than any doctrine could capture. Love created life even when that life was unplanned and secret. Tragedy revealed corruption and led to justice. Death sparked transformation in the living. And sometimes, the most sacred moments happened not in churches or through formal rituals, but in a prison infirmary at 4 a.m. when a father and son who barely knew each other chose forgiveness and grace over bitterness and blame. 2 years after David's death, James was invited to speak at a conference on criminal justice reform. He stood before an audience of lawmakers, advocates, former inmates and family members. And he told David's story again. But this time, he added something new. My son taught me in his final hours what I'd been trying to teach others for 20 years. James said, his voice steady now with the peace that comes from fully processed grief. He taught me that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about facing our failures and our pain, and choosing to transform them into purpose. David could have died angry at his mother for keeping secrets, angry at me for not being there, angry at the prison system that failed to protect him, angry at God for the unfairness of it all. But instead, he chose forgiveness. He chose to use his final breaths to fight for justice for others. He chose to give me the gift of knowing him. Brief though it was, he chose love over bitterness. And in doing so, he showed me what true faith looks like. After the speech, a young woman approached him. She was maybe 19, with haunted eyes and a defiance set to her shoulders. My dad's been in prison my whole life, she said without preamble. I've never met him. Mom says he's a piece of garbage who doesn't deserve my time. But I keep wondering about him. Keep wondering if he thinks about me. Keep wondering if I should reach out. James thought about David, about all the years he'd missed, about how that final hour together had been precious beyond measure, despite the grief. I can't tell you what to do, he said carefully. Your situation is unique to you, but I can tell you that knowing is better than wondering. Connection, even difficult connection, is better than the emptiness of never trying. If you reach out and he disappoints you, at least you'll know. But if you reach out and you find even a fragment of the relationship you're missing, it might change both your lives. The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you. That helps. James watched her walk away and sent up a silent prayer that she'd find whatever she needed, whatever David had given him. Peace, understanding, the knowledge that love could exist even in the most broken circumstances. 3 years after David's death, the reforms that his recordings had sparked began to take effect. Morrison and the other corrupt guards were serving long prison sentences themselves. New oversight committees had been established. Body cameras were now mandatory. Independent investigations of inmate deaths were standard procedure. David's Law, some people called it, though officially it was the Inmate Protection and Accountability Act. James knew David would have been embarrassed by the attention, but proud of the change. On the anniversary of David's death, James held a small memorial service in the prison chapel. A handful of inmates who'd known David attended, along with Rosa and a few advocates who'd helped expose the corruption. They shared memories and prayers and hopes for continued reform. And James read from a new letter, one he'd written to the son he'd never see again. Dear David, he read, his voice strong and clear. 3 years ago today, I lost you, but I also found you. In the brief time we had together, you gave me more than I gave you in an entire lifetime of absence. You gave me forgiveness I didn't deserve, understanding I hadn't earned, love I never expected. You showed me that fatherhood isn't just biology or presence, it's also legacy. You are my legacy, David. Not through genetics alone, but through the change you sparked. Every reform that makes prisons safer. Every family that stays connected across prison walls. Every inmate who receives fair treatment instead of abuse. That's all because of you. Because you were brave enough to document the truth. Because you were selfless enough to use your dying hours to fight for others. Because you were gracious enough to forgive the father who was never there. I carry you with me every day, in every prayer, in every counseling session with inmates who are fathers, in every moment when I choose truth over comfort. You made me a better priest and a better man. And though I'll never get to watch you grow old, never get to meet your children, never get to have all the conversations fathers and sons should have, I'm grateful for what we did share, for that final prayer, for hearing you call me Dad, for knowing that Maria's beautiful spirit lives on in you, and that your beautiful spirit lives on in the changes you created. Rest in peace, my son. Your father loves you. Always has. Always will. The small congregation sat in silence after he finished, many wiping tears. Then, slowly they began to share their own stories. An inmate talked about reconnecting with his daughter, because of the family connection program James had started. Rosa shared memories of David as a child, bright and curious and kind. An advocate discussed the legislative changes still being fought for, inspired by David's case. As James listened to these stories, he realized that grief and purpose weren't opposites, they were partners. His grief for David would never fully heal. The weight of missed opportunities would always be there. But that grief had been transformed into a mission that honored David's memory and helped others avoid similar tragedies. 4 years after David's death, James received an unexpected letter. It was from a woman named Christine Morrison, daughter of Frank Morrison, the guard whose corruption David had exposed. Father Sullivan, she wrote, I know this letter might be unwelcome, and I'll understand if you don't respond. But I needed to reach out after reading your essay about David Martinez. My father is serving 25 years for what he did. Our family has been destroyed by the revelation of his crimes. For a long time I hated David Martinez. I hated you for exposing my father. I hated everyone who'd contributed to his downfall. But recently I started volunteering with a prisoners' rights organization. I've met families torn apart by incarceration. I've heard stories of abuse and corruption. And I've realized that my father was wrong. What he did was evil. And David Martinez was a hero for stopping him, even at the cost of his own life. I'm writing to say thank you. Thank you for honoring David's courage. Thank you for turning his death into something meaningful. And thank you for continuing to minister to inmates despite everything my father and others like him have done. You show a grace I'm still trying to learn. If you're willing, I'd like to talk more. I'm studying social work now, hoping to work in prison reform. I'd value any wisdom you could share. James read the letter several times, marveling at the strange paths of redemption. Frank Morrison's daughter, seeking guidance from the father of the man Morrison had ordered killed. It was the kind of circular poetry that made James believe in divine purpose. He wrote back immediately, agreeing to meet with Christine. Their first conversation was awkward, both carrying the weight of their respective losses and guilts. But over time they developed an unlikely friendship. Christine became one of the most effective advocates for prison reform, bringing an insider's perspective on how corruption could flourish and how it could be prevented. She often spoke publicly about her father's crimes and her journey from denial to acceptance to action. And she always mentioned David Martinez, the man whose death had set her on this path. 5 years after David's death, on what would have been his 30th birthday, James received a package from Rosa. Inside was a photo album Maria had kept, documenting David's life from infancy through young adulthood. Page after page of moments James had missed. David's first day of school, gap-toothed and grinning. David in a soccer uniform, muddy and triumphant. David at his high school graduation, proud despite the absence of a father in the audience. David with Maria on what looked like her last birthday, both of them smiling despite the shadow of her illness. Each photo was a reminder of all James had lost, but they were also gifts, allowing him to know his son in ways he'd never imagined possible. Rosa had included notes on many of the photos, explaining the context, sharing what David had been like at different ages. "He was such a bright kid," she wrote on one page. "Always asking questions, always trying to figure out how things worked. He got that from Maria. But his sense of justice, his need to stand up for what was right even when it was hard. I think he got that from you. Even though he didn't know you, he inherited your moral courage." James created a small shrine in his quarters, David's photo, the letter, some of the pictures from Rosa's album. He prayed there each night, maintaining a conversation with the son he'd lost, telling David about his day, about the inmates he'd counseled, about the small victories in the ongoing fight for reform. Sometimes he felt foolish, talking to a photograph, but other times, he felt David's presence so strongly it was like he was in the room, listening, approving, encouraging his father to keep going. 6 years after David's death, James was diagnosed with cancer, prostate cancer, caught early but requiring treatment. As he sat in the oncologist's office receiving the news, he thought about Maria, who died of cancer, about David, who died far too young, about mortality and legacy, and what mattered in the end. He decided not to retire from his prison ministry, even as he underwent treatment. If anything, his illness made his work more urgent. He had a limited time left to make a difference, to honor David's memory, to transform his own grief and guilt into something that helped others. His fellow priests and the prison administration urged him to take time off, to focus on healing. But James knew that this work was his healing. Every inmate he counseled, every family he helped reconnect, every small reform he advocated for. This was how he processed his loss and his regrets. On the 7th anniversary of David's death, James's cancer was in remission. He stood in the prison chapel, now filled with dozens of inmates and staff and community members, who'd come to remember David and celebrate the changes his courage had sparked. The David Martinez Memorial Chapel, as it had been officially renamed, was a testament to how one person's final act of bravery could ripple outward for years. James looked around at the faces, some he knew well, and some he'd never met. Each person here had been touched by David's story in some way. Inmates who'd benefited from the reforms, guards who now worked in a safer, more accountable system, family members who'd been able to maintain better connections with incarcerated loved ones, advocates who'd been inspired by David's courage to fight even harder for justice. Dear viewers, sometimes the most important relationships in our lives last only a few hours. Sometimes we meet the people who change us forever in the last moments we have with them. Father James Sullivan gave last rites to 89 dying inmates before he met the 90th, his own son. 4 hours was all they had together. 4 hours to build a relationship that should have spanned a lifetime. 4 hours for David to reveal a secret, expose corruption, and offer forgiveness to the father who was never there. 4 hours for James to experience fatherhood for the first and last time. But those 4 hours changed everything. They exposed a pattern of violence and corruption that had gone unchecked for years. They led to reforms that protected hundreds of vulnerable inmates. They inspired a movement toward greater accountability and transparency in the prison system. And they showed both men what grace really means. David's grace in forgiving his absent father. James's grace in accepting that forgiveness and transforming his grief into purpose. Maria's grace in making an impossible choice to protect someone she loved, even at tremendous cost to herself. This story reminds us that it's never too late for truth, never too late for honesty about who we are and what we've done. Never too late to choose love over bitterness, forgiveness over resentment, purpose over despair. James spent 20 years as a prison chaplain before he knew David existed. But in the 10 years after David's death, armed with the knowledge of his son's courage and sacrifice, he became something more: an advocate, a reformer, a father not just to David but to every inmate who needed someone to fight for their dignity and their rights. David spent 25 years not knowing his father, but in his final 4 hours, he gave James the greatest gift possible: the truth about who he was, the chance to be a father however briefly. The opportunity to make David's death mean something by exposing the corruption that had taken his life, and the grace of forgiveness that allowed James to move forward without being crushed by the weight of all he'd missed. If this story moved you, Hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to remember that redemption is always possible. That 4 hours of truth and love can outweigh 25 years of absence. That the courage to speak up, even when it costs everything, can change the world for people you'll never meet. Remember David Martinez, who used his dying breaths to fight for justice. Remember Father James Sullivan, who turned personal tragedy into a mission that saved countless families from similar pain. Remember Maria Santos, who made an impossible choice and raised a son who became a hero. And remember that sometimes, even in our darkest moments, even when time is running out, even when all we have is 4 hours, love finds a way to make those hours matter forever.